Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Joe Emilio Show. I'm your host, Joe Emilio, and as you can see on my left, I've got Ernst Roets with us. Ernst Roets, sorry, from AfriForum, has joined on the show tonight to chat about his surprise visit, which Ernst was like. I mean, let's get right into it. I mean, the day you announced that you were in America, Twitter woke everyone just went absolutely berserk. It was amazing. Well done. How did you pull it off? Because so many people were asking, like, how did you have to take the vaccine? I got so many questions.
Uh, you mean how did I get to America?
Yeah, I mean, like, everybody was like, how did he do it? It's a pandemic
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
moment.
I saw one journo was saying that I'm getting preferential treatment based on my political views, which is very odd.
Yeah.
To think that for someone with my political views to get preferential treatment. No, so it's actually not really a secret. I mean, you can just go through the travel regulations and see it's not impossible to go to the US.
Mm.
I was part of a liaison tour with the Solidarity Movement to Hungary at the beginning of June, from about the 6th. I think I flew to Hungary on the 6th of June. We were there for just over a week. And I, at the time, I was busy talking with Tucker Carlson and his team about the possibility of an interview. So I remember when I left on the 6th, um, it was a bit awkward and sad in a way because I didn't know when I'm going to come back. Because I might go to the US, I might not. And so while we were there, it was sort of sorted out and it was confirmed that they want me in studio, they want me to go through. And so I had to figure out how to get to the US, and you can't fly to the US from Hungary or from South Africa. I think you might be able to if you are vaccinated. I didn't get vaccinated in Hungary, and so I had to go for Plan B. And given that I have a US visa and I have a South African passport, so what I was able to do was to go from certain South African country or African countries at least. You can fly to the US if you've been there for 14 days and if you have a negative PCR test. And so I opted for Tanzania or Tanzania. I never know what the correct pronunciation is. People pronounce it in both ways, but Tanzania in Afrikaans. And I stayed. It sounds very romantic, but it wasn't really. I had a hotel room in Dar es Salaam, and I basically stayed there for 14 days. So I wasn't able to go to Zanzibar or the Serengeti or any of those things. I stayed at the inn where I was, and after 14 days, I was able to fly to the US, and that's the story.
Huh, interesting. Okay, so now everyone's planning as you're talking now. They're booking their flights as we speak. Um,
I think
so,
what I can add, sorry, part of the confusion, and it was, I have to say, slightly deliberate, is when I was in Dar es Salaam, I never said to anyone that I mean, obviously my colleagues knew, but I never said publicly that I'm in Tanzania or Dar es Salaam. So publicly, no one knew that. But about halfway through the trip, or through the visit through the stay in Dar es Salaam, I tweeted a photo of me in Budapest. And I didn't say I am in Budapest. I just tweeted a photo of me in Budapest with the Ronald Reagan statue. And I think I just said Ronald Reagan statue in Budapest or something. And so when this one journo, I can't remember his name, guy from an ex South African who now lives in New York, he was sort of trying to figure out how did I get there, and he saw the photo I tweeted, and he figured out that okay, I must have been in Budapest, 7 days or something before leaving to the US. So obviously I wasn't in Dar es Salaam for 14 days. So they had this whole sort of trying to
oh my
figure
word.
out how did I get there, but there really isn't a big story.
No, again, I just remember how like you tweeted that I think you were in front of
Capitol Hill, yeah,
Capitol Hill. Yes, you were in front of
yeah.
Capitol Hill, and then wow, for like 2 days, everybody's like, "How can this be?" And it's like, guys, Like, what's the big deal? It's Ernst going to America to talk and do his thing. Like, what's the
Yeah.
big freaking deal? Anyway, so was it only Tucker Carlson that you went to go see, or did you
It,
happen to meet other people?
Tucker was the only interview I did, but I did have um, a few meetings, not a lot. I spoke with some people I know because we've got quite a bit of a network in Washington. So I only sort of touched base with some people, had a lunch meeting with someone. There were two people I had a telephone meeting with. Um, People are working from home, so they said, let's just have a telephone conversation. So I was in Washington for a few days. I arrived, I think, on the Friday. And as far as I recall, I left on the Monday or the Tuesday. I left to Maine because that's where the studio is, where I was interviewed. So I was, I think, yeah, I left on the Tuesday. So I had a meeting, lunch meeting on the Monday, and one or two telephone conversations. And it was actually a holiday in the US. And I didn't even know it until like a week before I arrived there that I was going to be there over the 4th of July. Um,
Ah,
and
nice.
obviously that wasn't planned. It just happened. And so it was a great experience to be in Washington on the 4th of July.
Yeah,
But the Monday
fireworks.
was a public holiday, but I was able to meet with some people at least.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, it's. I watched your interview with, or at least the clip that was released
Yeah,
of the interview with you and Tucker. Very interesting, and I would like to ask you a few questions about that interview. For those of you who haven't
sure.
seen it, just go Google Ernest Roets, Tucker Carlson. It will pop up. But yeah, so you mentioned a lot of interesting things in that clip that I wanted to discuss with you. So you say the beginning of the clip talks about South Africa being an experiment.
Yeah.
Can you can you clarify that for us? Because I feel like there wasn't a lot of context in that clip.
Yes. Yeah, so that's part of the problem with the clip. So the entire interview was an hour long, and it was published in its entirety on Fox Nation, which is like the online version of Fox News. But we don't have access to it in South Africa. You can access it if you have a VPN. So that's the part they chose. I actually had got a different clip with some more segments from the interview that I published on my Facebook page. It's about 20 minutes long. So if you watch the clip on my Facebook page and you watch the YouTube clip,
Okay.
um, it's about half of the interview that you can see. Yeah. So the experiment part, the context there is so, well. Let's put it this way. So the interview started with Tucker saying he remembers when he was young. I think he said when he was in university or something like that. When he was younger, people in America often spoke about South Africa, and people were angry about South Africa, and there was the Free Mandela movement, and Tucker supported that, and people wanted apartheid to end, and they wanted a new, fairer system. And so that's sort of his intro to the interview or the discussion. And then he said, so 1994 happened. Before 1994, in the run up to 94, the US put a lot of pressure on South Africa, on the National Party government, and on the ANC to accept or adopt a certain type of political system, which is, you can call it liberal democracy. It's a constitution with individual rights entrenched, and so forth. A
Hmm.
democracy with individual rights. And so Tucker said, okay, well, 1994 happened, and everyone celebrated this as a miracle, and then everyone stopped talking about South Africa, and now it's 2021. So what happened after 94? So that's how he started. And I remember thinking when he asked me that, wow, how do you answer that? So I said to him, well, I don't know where to start, and we started talking about race laws, which isn't part of the segment that's on YouTube. And I mentioned to him that there's more than 80 race laws in South Africa and so forth. But to get to the question about the experiment, so the point I was making is that back in the early 90s, when people were talking about the new political system, the new dispensation, people refer to this new system as the South African experiment. And I haven't heard that recently, but you still hear people talking about the South African project. And the reason why I said it was an experiment, why I say it was an experiment, is it was an idea. It was something that hasn't really been tried, but it's sort of a theory on what would be the best way to govern South Africa, or to for South Africa to be governed. And the idea was, okay, we have this theory, we're quite sure it's going to work. It's like this hypothesis, and we're quite sure it's going to work. So let's try it. And in reality, that didn't work. And what I'm saying, the part that didn't work is that we have this system, this political system that is very centralized. But oftentimes, you hear people say, no, actually, we have a very decentralized system, because if you look at the constitution, this clause says that and that clause says that, but in reality it's very centralized. It's the central government, the ANC or Lutuli House, if you want to put it that way, they run the country, and you can't really do anything if it's not in line with their ideology. And also part of the reason also why it's an experiment is the idea was that we know South Africa is very diverse. We have all these different cultural communities. We have all these different languages, well, 11 official languages and so forth. But let's sort of group everything together and give everyone this new overarching identity. And this new identity is South Africanism, in a way. To say, and that's so I quoted the statement by Samora Machel when he said, "For the nation to prosper, the tribe must die." And then the point thereof is that for South Africa, the South African project to work, there's a lot of pressure on people's what I call natural identities. In other words, it's just how you naturally see yourself. Like, and it's usually cultural identities, or it could be religious identities. It's however if someone asks you, what are you? Back in '94, a lot of people didn't say I'm a South African. People would say I'm a Zulu, or I'm an English speaking South African. Some people would say, oh, I'm an Afrikaner or a Boer or something like that. And so there's a lot of pressure on these natural identities to be sort of neglected, or to be held back on the back seat, so that we can all be South Africans and pretend that we're all the same. While in reality, we're not really all the same. And that's part of the underlying thing here.
Yeah, the South African Rainbow Nation narrative, so to speak.
Yes, this Rainbow Nation idea, and I mean, you can say we are all South Africans and so forth, and that's great, but if the underlying notion is for this project to work, we need to pressure people to sort of change their identity, or sort of to step back from how they naturally identify or define themselves. So you're basically telling people to change their identity in a way, force or pressuring people. And I've heard it a lot with AfriForum. Many times I would be in an interview and I would say, for example, Afrikaners they think, in the following way about this issue. And then someone would say, but why are you talking about Afrikaners? You should be talking about South Africans. Or, you can be an Afrikaner as long as it doesn't stand in the way of South Africanism or whatever. And that type of thing, in the long run, it just creates a backlash because people lose their sense of belonging. And I think that's part of the underlying issue here.
Yes. Okay. So thank you for clarifying that. I thought it was, yeah, the whole notion of the Rainbow Nation and, becoming one, which was, I think after Nelson Mandela was in power, that was a very big, like, there was a lot of propaganda around that.
Yeah.
And the one thing that also I thought, like, how do I say this? Okay, let's just be frank in this conversation. So one of the things that I felt that maybe is happening in South Africa at the moment, is with this experiment, is the whole wokeism and identity politics. I feel like that is something that the ANC is pushing. We see it with the mainstream media, we see it with the ANC, this whole attack on racism. And even though, IRR and I don't know if you know that organization, Racism is Not the Problem, did polls saying that, actually racism isn't the major problem in South Africa. But anyway, even though the ANC would have you believe it is, and the mainstream media. So basically my question here is, like, would you agree, or what is your view on the ideological happenings at the moment of the ANC pushing this wokeism and identity politics?
Well, I think, that's maybe the part I didn't say about this experiment. So at the time, it wasn't a secret that the ANC was also, let's be frank, was a communist organization, or, was funded by the Soviet Union. Everyone knew that. They had been paid by the Soviet Union to go on a study tour to Vietnam, where they learned about Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh and all these people. And the ANC was openly communist, or socialist, if you want to, use frame it slightly more palatable.
Yeah.
And at the time, what the ANC actually said, and these were part of the contrasting views, is in the early 90s, the ANC, and especially Joe Slovo played a particular role in this, said that the democracy, that's what they said, democracy is the road to socialism. In other words, they presented themselves as being, liberal Democrats, while they weren't really. They presented themselves as such, and they figured that if we can achieve with this one man, one vote, liberal democratic system, we can get control of the levers of power, and then we can use the mechanisms of the state to further the goals of the revolution, which is the National Democratic Revolution. And they spoke about it since the 70s, I think. And that's part of why I describe it as an experiment, because the idea at the time, people knew the ANC were socialists or communists. And the idea, the argument was that let's just adopt this liberal democratic system and eventually they will become liberal Democrats. So that's part of the experiment. And some of the National Party leaders at the time very naively said, they were criticized. People said, well, it's not going to be sustainable because the ANC wants a revolution. They're quite outspoken about this. And then some of them said publicly that they can't understand why people are skeptical about a future under an ANC government, because we all know Mandela is going to be the president. And yes, everyone knew Mandela was going to be the president, and that was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And Mandela's not alive anymore, and he had a successor, and his successor had a successor, and we're, 4 or 5 presidents down the line. So it's very naive to say we know Mandela's going to be the president, and so he's going to make sure that we keep things on track. So let's adopt this system. So don't worry about the concern that the ANC is going to use this liberal democratic system to further a revolution. And that's part of the experiment. The experiment was that we can sort of peer pressure the ANC into changing their ideology, and that didn't happen. So where they used to say that democracy is the road to socialism, now they say socialism is the road to communism. And I've asked ANC members to explain to me what's the difference between socialism and communism, and they have the same answer all the time. They say socialism is the road to communism. So yes, and that leads to this wokeism, postmodern type thing that we have now. It's not, wokeism is not the same as classical liberalism, but that's where we are now. And I think it's because we have the system has to a large extent been hijacked, and it's being used. There's a strong argument to be made that we have a liberal constitution. I know there's some people say no, it's obvious we have a progressive constitution, but there's a strong argument to be made that the South African constitution is actually liberal, classically liberal, you could say. But the ANC is using it not to promote liberal values, but to promote socialist ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, EWC, taking away or trying to take away our right to self-defense with guns. NHI. I mean, the list can go on and on. All these little amendments that they keep on trying to push through.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, it's okay. So I was, I've often thought of like, you mentioned earlier that it's people know that the Communist Party funded the ANC. I gotta be honest, Ernst. I speak to a lot of people, like the average South African, and they deny that. They think it's a lie. They say no, it's not true. How can ANC be communist and blah blah blah? Even though for some reason, like, out in the open, they say like we want EWC, and that kind of worries people, but they are fooled by the mainstream media that say, oh, this time it will be different, which you and Tucker had a discussion about that. That's the excuse all the time. What do you say to South Africans that are still in denial about these identity politics and wokeism and agenda?
So firstly, when I say people knew that, I'm not so much referring to the general public, but people who were involved with the negotiations, people in the US with the United States, NSA and intelligence community, who were pressuring South Africa into the CIA and so forth into adopting a particular system. They knew, because they had a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And it wasn't a secret. I mean, people in the Soviet Union spoke about it publicly. The ANC spoke about it publicly. Oliver Tambo spoke about it. Mandela spoke about it. Obviously, Joe Slovo and Chris Hani.
Yeah.
It wasn't a secret. It was an open thing. They went on this study tour to Vietnam. They came back and they said, "This is the lessons we learned," and so forth. And they had these conferences in Kabwe and all these African countries, Lusaka and so forth, where they spoke about ANC ideology or ANC goals and communism and the alliance with the Communist Party and so forth. But yes, a lot of people don't know that, and it's frustrating. I mean, if people don't know that, it's fine, but it's a problem if people have very, entrenched political views about South Africa or South African history or what we ought to be doing now or the road we ought to take, but they don't know certain basic facts about South African history. And you don't need to be an expert in history. I'm certainly not an expert in history. You don't need to be an expert in history to have an opinion, but you must at least be informed to a certain extent. And to not know that the ANC has always very openly aligned with communism is just naive. It's not some conspiracy theory. You can just look it up. You can just go to the ANC's website and read their own documents. So yes, I think it's a big problem. The fact that and it's even more so on economics. And also, I'm not an economist, but it's very frustrating when people have these very strong opinion about economics, and then but they obviously have no clue how the economy works or what an economy actually is. When people would say things like, yes, EWC is going to be great for the economy because, and then they would pull out some theory, it's how can you not concede that we're going to have massive economic growth if we take people's private property, because then they would have some explanation, and they obviously don't know the first thing about economics. And so that's ignorance is a massive problem, especially. And again, if people are ignorant, that's fine. If you have some occupation that's not political and you're ignorant about politics because you don't care, that's fine. But if you have this very outspoken opinion, and if you go on Twitter and you start attacking people based on your very ignorant political views, I mean, it's counterproductive.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's like I said, it always flabbergasts me. I'm like, because it didn't take me too long to figure it out. And like you said,
Yeah.
people just research about it. Because I was also in that mindset, because you get fooled by what you spoke about, the experiment. You get fooled by it. You get caught up in it. When I first moved to South Africa, nearly 13, 14 years ago, I did a bit of research on South Africa. I read the history, and it was all about how great Nelson Mandela is and how he helped bring down the terrible apartheid regime, which it was. It was a terrible regime, but
Yeah, sure.
and this whole Rainbow Nation propaganda that they had. And I was, for many years in South Africa, fooled by that. And yeah, the experiment now is I think I despite where you sit on the argument about Nelson Mandela, because some people like to say that he was a terrorist. Other people say he was a good guy. Just ANC rotted him. Regardless of that, I did see, or I did notice, a significant shift in the ANC after Thabo Mbeki's presidency. That's when I feel
Yes.
things just went completely like a whole U-turn. So yeah. All right. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, speaking about South Africa and where it's headed and stuff like that. I wanted to get your view on South Africa in the future. There's a lot of talk now. If you follow Center for Risk Analysis, Ramon Kabanek, Morning Shot, a lot of people saying that in the next 5 to 10 years, ANC probably won't be in power, and if they are, what's going to happen is state failure, and basically enclaves are going to be a thing that South Africa is going to basically. That's what's going to happen. Basically, communities, almost like many Aranyas, basically sprouting up in South Africa. Do you share this sentiment, or do you think South Africa is going to go down a different path?
In a way, yes. Although I'm not convinced that the ANC is going to go down as quickly as a lot of people say. Um, it's it's really hard to convince people who keep voting for the ANC to stop voting because, and that's part of the experiment argument, because a lot of people, or people tend to vote. Uh, People tend to have their voting patterns informed by identity. And there is a fear, and I'm obviously not an ANC voter, but there's obviously a fear among ANC voters that even though they dislike the ANC, or even though they can see the ANC is not a good government, at least it's sort of, at least they're sort of on our side. So we can't vote for whichever other party, because they don't, they're not regarded as being on our side, in a certain sense. Um, so I obviously the ANC is not going to govern forever. It's a fact. Although I think there's a lot that still has to happen to change the reality that the ANC is going to win the next election. I would be very, very surprised. Although there's still a lot of water that has to go under the bridge, so we'll see. But I am convinced that this, let's call it the system that we have, is not going to, it's not sustainable, and it's not that odd. It's a natural thing. It has been a normal phenomenon over the world that constitutions don't last forever. They are the US is one of the few exceptions of a country with a constitution that lasted more than 100 years. There was a study done by the University of Chicago. People can look it up. I think it's called The Age of Constitutions, or The Average Age of Constitutions. It's very easy to find on Google. And I believe the number, if I recall correctly, they said that the average constitution survives for about 21 years, might be less even. And then they said in Africa, it's much less. It's something like 13 or something. I can't remember the exact year, but it's around there. On average, a constitution doesn't last that long. So the point is not the constitution. The point is I want to say the constitution with a small letter C. In other words, if you say there's a constitution with a capital C and a constitution with a small letter C, the difference is the constitution with a capital C is the book with the text, with section 1, section 2. And then the constitution with a small letter C is what the word constitution meant throughout the ages, which is sort of the reality on ground level. The political reality is the constitution, or how the country is constituted. And I think there's going to be some form of a change in the future. And it's something that we can be concerned about, and it's something that we can be optimistic about, and it can make things better and it can make things worse. I do think the prediction, or the scenario, or the analysis that well-organized communities are going to be able to flourish, while communities that aren't well-organized are going to have a hard time. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and we can see it. We can see the signs of that already, and we saw that now with these riots. Communities that were well-organized, that had safety structures, that had neighborhood watches, the police were basically bystanders in this whole thing. But people who were well-organized were able to keep the rioters at bay, and were able to defend themselves. And there's some interesting stories about, for example, how the people of Bangola defended their town and prevented these rioters from entering, and so forth. And if you're not well organized, I think you're going to have a hard time. If you are detached or from your community, or if a community is not properly structured, I think they're going to have a hard time. But if they are, I don't think we're going to have a crash and burn Zimbabwe type situation in South Africa. I do think it's highly likely that we're going to have a slow deterioration. I don't foresee some massive spike in economic growth or something like that in the near future. I think there's going to be a deterioration. Local communities that are well organized are going to flourish, and that might lead to some new type of I don't want to say negotiation, some new type of, let's call it a settlement, or an agreement among these communities on how the country, should be going forward. I think that's what's going to happen.
Interesting. I'm also leaning towards that. After doing some research and listening to Franz Cornier from
Mm.
IRR and his reasoning behind why he thinks that's going to happen. So yeah, I would tend to agree with you. Having said that, you spoke with Tucker as well. He asked you, there's been an exodus from South Africa,
Yeah.
and you explained why. But do you think people should leave South Africa after what we just said? Do you think there's hope? Do you think there's a reason for people to stay?
Yeah. Well, I've never seriously considered leaving South Africa. It's just something that's, as far as I'm concerned, it's not on the table. It's not an option that I've ever considered. Obviously, you think about it because people ask you, and I think what I do know is some people leave the country and they are very happy, and they try to convince others to leave as well. I know of a lot of people who have left South Africa who are frustrated, who feel detached in a way, who feel like they've lost something, they've lost the sense of their identity, who feel alienated where they are, and so forth. And I have a colleague actually who has quite a lot of family who live abroad in Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And this colleague of mine summed it up pretty well. Is a lot of people, there's argument about the grass is greener on the other side, and his view is he's been there, his family lives there, he knows their frustrations and what makes them happy and so forth. And his argument is the grass that's most important is the grass that's greener on this side of the fence. So I think, yeah, I think we're going to go through some difficult times in the future. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But I do think, and that's part of the segment they used. I think that's why they used that particular segment on the YouTube section they published. Is when I said that in a way the future has already happened in South Africa. I mean, you can leave South Africa because you're concerned about what's happening and what's going to happen. But a lot of the problems that South Africa is facing now and is going to face in the next 5 to 10 years are just problems that the rest of the world is going to face maybe in 20 years or 30 years. I'm concerned about what's happening in America with good reason. I'm concerned about what's happening in Europe with good reason. And I think these countries or continents or however are going to have a lot of problems in the future. And I honestly think, and this might sound in a way idealistic, but this is really what I think. I think if we can pull this through, if we have well organized communities and we can make a I don't want to say rise out of the ashes. I don't want to sound that dramatic, but if we can ensure a future despite these circumstances, I'm absolutely convinced that the rest of the world is going to be looking at what happened in South Africa to learn from what we've done as people in this country, as communities working together. And I don't see a future. Yeah, I mean, obviously, our history is one of conflict, but we also have a very important history of a diplomatic history, so to speak. When you think about Afrikaner history, you think about, oh, okay, there were the wars with the British and they had the wars with the Zulus and so forth. But in between that, there was a very long and a very rich history of cooperation with various cultural communities and so forth. And I think we must put a lot of effort into cooperation between cultural communities, working together, seeing each other as allies, even though we disagree on some ideological things and so forth. But we need to see each other as allies from which we can learn and with whom we can work together. And I really think the rest of the world is, if we can pull this through, and I think we will, because I'm convinced of that because we can see it working already to a smaller extent, that people are going to be learning from South Africa in the future. And that's something that excites me.
Yeah, well, I've always said on this channel as well, South Africans are resilient. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think I've ever, like, because I've been to many places in the world, and like, I don't know, South Africans just feel like no matter what, they will
Mm.
persevere, they will get through, and it doesn't. I'm not like Afrikaners, coloreds, blacks,
Yeah.
Indians, all of them will fight, fight, fight to survive, and again, we saw
Yeah.
it in the KZN riots, people coming together, fighting and standing up for their community, which was amazing. And
Mm.
I think this is where, that hope of enclaves and so to speak, those things will definitely be, like you said, prosperous and who knows, maybe worth the wait. I just worry about what the ANC is going to do in the future, but
Mm.
Only time will tell. So one final question before. So basically, for those of you that are watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new. I have with me Ernst Roets from Afriforum. We're chatting about his visit to USA, and we're gonna be going over some of the questions that we missed out from our last interview, which I'm gonna bring up just now. But first, one
Sure.
final question. I want to know your opinion on Cape Independence or Cape Secession, Western Cape Secession. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that there's an underlying principle that's very important, and that's the principle of federalism, or you can use the word autonomy. That's something that I think we should all support. I think we've learned the lesson, a very hard lesson in South Africa. If we weren't able to predict it before, at least we should now be able to learn from experience that this aggressive centralization of power doesn't work. It's a slippery slope. It leads towards a cliff. Um, so we need decentralization of power, and that includes the basic thing is less power for a central government, more autonomy for the provinces, but not only the provinces, local communities should be able to decide over things that are important to them. So the way I look at it is I grew up in the north of South Africa, in Limpopo, and it was about how far? I know if you measure it in miles, it's about 1,000 miles from Cape Town. So you have people. I grew up in a agricultural community, a rural community. That was let's if we use miles as a reference, that was 1,000 miles away from where the Parliament building is. So we had people in Parliament, and obviously still do, who, for example, grew up in Cape Town, who are Cape Townians, who are now members of Parliament, who are making laws that are applicable to people who live 1,000 miles away from them, and through various communities and cultures and so forth. And by that logic, you could say that someone who lives in Messina, let's use Messina, um, if you can make laws that are applicable to people who you've never met, who live 1,000 miles away from you, that means someone in Messina, by that logic, should be able to make laws that are applicable to people who live in Uganda and Tanzania and Zambia and these countries, because that's how far away it is. So the point is, our system is just way too centralized. Now we can argue about what is the way to how should we sort of devolve this. And so some people are arguing for secession and so forth, and others are saying no, we just need more autonomy. I mean, we can have that discussion, and we should have that discussion, but there's an underlying principle that I think every rational thinking person in this country who have eyes and ears should agree with, and that is that we should have decentralization of power. We should give more power to provinces and to local communities to decide over things that are important to them, and not have some central government with a very strong, very obvious ideological mission to implement a revolution, to decide on behalf of 60 million people what is in their interest.
That's a very diplomatic answer. I think. Well, first let me address before I have to address these. Thank you, Paulie7 Fire, for the 20 Rand super chat. It says lekker chat, gents. Thank you so much, Paulie, for tuning in. And Deborah Oliver also giving 140 Rand super chat. Thank you so much, Deborah. I am a proud member of Afriforum. Great chat, Joe. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for supporting Afriforum as well. So thank you guys so much for the super chats. It is greatly appreciated. It goes a long way to supporting the channel. Okay, so but again, I'm going to ask you again because I don't feel I got an answer. I got an answer that you support federalism. I think
Yeah.
that was the thing. But how do you feel? How would you feel if Western Cape got secession? Do you
Particularly on secession.
yeah, like would Afriform or Ernest no, not Afriform. Let me rather say Ernest Roets, the individual Ernest Roets. Um, do you support it, or are you like support it in the sense of like, you know what, everyone deserves, if there is a group of people that want to secede, they have the right to do so, um, or are you against it?
No, well, I can tell you, I'm certainly not against it. And if it's if you ask my personal opinion, I would support it.
Mm,
The reason why my previous answer, my answer to your previous question was a bit more broader is because we need to work with what's, I don't want to say realistic, but what's tangible.
mm,
And I think if we as AfriForum try to start from walking, not even walking in a particular direction, to running full speed, we're just going to alienate people.
mm,
So there's a lot of people. We've had many discussions with people, particularly on this topic. We had a study tour to the Western Cape. We spent a week there earlier this year. We met with a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and what we found, our personal experience is almost, not almost, every single person we spoke with agree about the fact that we need more autonomy
mm,
for, in this particular context, the Western Cape. In other words, the Western Cape should have more authority to decide over things that are important to them. But many of the people we spoke with, when you mention something like secession, they sort of start backpedaling, or they say no, we should oppose it, or we don't support that. And there are people who campaign for secession, and I think that's good. I think it's a good thing. I think it should be part of the discussion and part of the debate. I think just strategically speaking, it makes more sense for an organization like AfriForum to talk about growing autonomy. In other words, you can move one step towards more autonomy, and then when you've established that reality, you can take another step towards more autonomy, and then you can take another step towards more autonomy. But if we only talk about the let's say hypothetically speaking, let's say secession is the end prize or the end goal. If we only talk about that, we're not gonna get people to follow us, or we're not gonna get people to really support the idea, because we've seen it. There's a lot of people. I mean, there are polls who say many more people support the idea than we tend to think, and I really agree with that. But just from our personal discussions with people, if you talk about more autonomy, growing autonomy, federalism, decentralization of power, people agree. And I think secession is one of those words that's very politically loaded.
mm.
So I'm not saying we shouldn't use it. I'm saying I don't think it's AfriForum's role to push for that. But AfriForum is not going to oppose it when people push for that. That's not our role. Our role is growing autonomy, more autonomy, not only for the Western Cape, but for communities in general.
Yeah, fair enough. I just again have to address this game bread giving it 35 rand super sticker. Thank you so much for saying
Mm.
keep it up. And Conscious Caracal has also joined the conversation saying
Mm.
good evening, Conscious Caracal. Please, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't yet, please go check out Conscious Caracal. And he also interviewed Ernst about
Yeah.
the US, so please go check out
Yes.
that conversation. Very interesting conversation. Yeah, look, I think what you have to say is fair on secession. It's one of those topics at the moment that is really dividing South Africa as well. I feel because there's this push that people want it and they feel it's better because the Western Cape has always been governed by the DA, or not always, but recently been governed
Mm.
by the DA. They're governed by a different political party. They have different, like you just said, the whole idea of being governed, and from a distance, and then you've got the other side, the mainstream media, calling it a racist movement and all these
Yeah.
horrible things.
Crazy.
And then
Everything
of
is
course,
racist.
yeah, because it's not South African. It's not, if you break away,
Yeah.
then you're not South African, and that for me is like it was weird. If anything, I think the Western Cape is the closest idea to a rainbow nation, because there's all different kinds
Mm.
of races that exist in the Western Cape. Christians, Muslims, Hindus all get along. Even when
And they
you
have much less of a race nationalist ideological push than the
exactly.
central government, than the ANC does.
Exactly. So, I don't know. It remains to be seen. I definitely would like to see what happens with secession. Apparently, a little birdie told me that some news is going to come out about a new poll that
Mm.
the Cape Independence Advocacy Group has recently done again, a more recent poll. So I'll be keeping you guys up to date with that as soon as it comes out. But anyway, Let's move on. Let's very quickly, because I only got you for another 15 minutes, make this as quick as possible because we promised that we would do some questions from the previous interview. Um, this one's very easy, very simple. What year did AfriForum start? Someone asked that.
2006.
Cool. That was simple. It's not a test, people. Okay, so this one was a bit confusing because they didn't. I'm going to read the question and hopefully we can try and decipher it. Why can't the cycle be clarified? What percentage of land has been swapped for money already? The land is not infinite. If money was taken for land and that percentage is not available, then that percentage is not available anymore. So I think we were talking about the land
Yes.
and
Yeah.
who owns what land, and we spoke about people that took that were offered land or money and they took the money. So I think the question here is what percentage of the land has been swapped for money already? I think that's the
Yeah.
question.
Okay. I'll try. I know you said you have a list of questions, so I'll try to answer short. I'll try to give short answers and not elaborate too much. I don't think there's an official number on that, but I do think that's a very important question because people, the ANC, just look at it as, oh, there were cases in the past where people were deprived of their land, and this has to be rectified. So now, just on the basis of skin color, we're just going to start, redistribution. Well, what they actually, and that's the difference between restitution and redistribution. It's
Yes.
redistribution is to say, at least in this context, is to say, what's the color of your skin? Okay, oh, you're a white guy, so that means you're an illegitimate owner of land. Because in the past, there were some white people who stole land or who got land through illegitimate means. Obviously, there were black people who also got land through illegitimate means. But the point is, we need to be looking at what actually happened on a particular piece of land. And you can, I don't know about percentages, but you can trace the history of a farm and see what did this belong to a particular community? Was it taken from them through some illegitimate means? If so, then there's an argument about land reform. If not, if the land was bought or something like that, then there's not an argument about land reform, or there shouldn't be.
Okay. Well, there you go. How much land does the government own?
25%, more or less, own and control. If you add up land that they own and land that they control, it's about one quarter of the country. So think about it this way: if you drive from Pretoria to Cape Town, and let's say hypothetically speaking, it's 1,000 kilometers, and if the road that you were to drive was representative of land ownership in South Africa, if the N1 was representative of all the land in South Africa, that means that, and if the road was, if it was 1,000 kilometers, that means 250 kilometers of the land that you would drive past would be land owned or controlled by the government already.
Cool. And then does that mean that the other 75% is owned by people?
It's owned by private individuals, trusts, companies, and so forth. And that's part of the problem is people only think about individuals when the reality is a lot of the land, or most of the land actually, is owned by companies or trusts which are usually or almost always multiracial. Some company would own a piece of land and there would be white and black people who are part of that company. So it's very difficult to say this is the percentage of land that is owned or controlled by a particular racial group, unless you only look at land owned by individuals, which is, if I recall, somewhere around 30%. It's about a third of the country is owned by individuals. So that's part of the problem and part of the dishonesty about land ownership in South Africa.
Also, there's a percentage that is actually you can't even live on it. Like
Yeah,
it's
especially in the western parts of the country, and there's a very strong percentage that where you can't really farm, and that's part of the problem is the ANC just they see, oh yeah, there's a farm somewhere in the Northern Cape that's 10,000 hectares, and that's unfair because somewhere in KwaZulu Natal there's a guy that only has 50 hectares. The fact is that in the Karoo in the Northern Cape, you can't farm with a small farm. It's just economically impossible because you farm with sheep, and it's a desert. So you need a massive farm to have some form of sustainability. And
yeah.
also, there's been studies. I quoted it when I spoke in Parliament in 2018 about the percentage of land in South Africa on which you can actually live sustainably if you don't have the ability or the capacity to dig a borehole, and it's about 30%. So
Mm.
the vast majority of the country in South Africa, if you can't dig a borehole or if you don't have access to one, you can't live there. You can't survive there.
Yeah.
At least a normal, everyday people won't be able to survive there. I know the Bushmen or the Khoi and the San, figured out ways to survive, but that's more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, the land debate is a very complex one. Well, it's not that complex once you have the real facts in front of you, I guess. But yeah, the ANC likes to twist those numbers all the time. All right, so moving on. I think you did answer this during the stream, but just in case you didn't, who is the most frustrating person you have ever debated? I would go with Eusebius.
The most frustrating person. I honestly don't know. Might be Eusebius.
Or that guy from Black, what's it? Land
It's
First?
probably the BLF,
Yes.
Black First Land First. It's probably someone from BLF. I mean, I don't do debates with BLF anymore, but it's
Yeah.
just because they scream over you, they don't
Yeah.
listen to what you're saying. Eusebius, at least, he says crazy things. He would accuse us of saying crazy things, but in a way, at least he responds to what you're saying. He's at least listening to try to catch you out.
Yes.
If you talk to these BLF guys, they don't have a clue what you're saying. So it's probably someone from there. I think I've said this publicly before, but um, I actually I think I have, well, at least from my part, I believe I have a good relationship with Nicholas Bauer. I know a lot of people who really like Nicholas Bauer really dislike AfriForum and dislike me, and a lot of people who like AfriForum and who agree with what I'm saying and some things really dislike Nicholas Bauer. What I do appreciate about Nicholas um, is he's open to talk. Nicholas has invited me to interviews many times, and he would confront me about something, but he at least is open to a discussion. So that's something. Maybe if I can answer the question that way, but yeah, I would have to think who the most frustrating person is. It would probably be someone from BLF. It's a good question. I'll have to think about it.
All right. All right. So some questions from tonight. There's only three. Very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go. Yeah. So this JP asked earlier, how can AfriForum hold government accountable since all evidence suggests that this was caused by infighting by the ruling ANC, and he's
Yeah.
talking in regards to the KZN riots.
Okay, so I can answer that in 20 minutes just because I've had long conversations about this with people and internal debates. And the debates I've been involved with is to what extent, with my colleagues and so forth, is to what extent should we blame what happened on human agency is the word that was used, or some form of an attempted insurrection, to what extent was this planned, and to what extent was this, I don't want to use the word spontaneous, but to what extent was this just something that we could predict? And some of my colleagues disagree. I think it's a very good, healthy discussion to have. My argument is that this was very predictable. I think, and this is me personally, my personal view, I think, yes, there were people who were trying to plan this. I think they were just incidentally planning something that would have happened in any case. I remember when I heard the news, I was in Dar es Salaam when the news came through that there was a warrant for Zuma's arrest. And immediately, I immediately picked up my phone and I sent a WhatsApp to some of my colleagues and I said, there's going to be massive riots. And I added that, well, it's sort of incidental that we have this Tucker Carlson interview coming up. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot more emphasis on South Africa in the next few weeks, which means the interview is going to get much more traction. And that was my immediate, and it's not because I have this, this wisdom that other people don't have. I mean, if you told people the news just broke, Zuma's going to get arrested, or there's a warrant issued for his arrest. We don't know if he's going to be arrested. There was a warrant issued. What's going to happen? People would predict that there's going to be riots. So yes, but I don't want to discount the fact that there was certainly people who were obviously planning this. I think the conclusion we got, I'm spending too much time on this answer, but the conclusion we got was the metaphor of a can of Coke, something that one of my colleagues used, is a can of Coke and you add sugar to the Coke. And the point is, the Coke wouldn't have boiled over if someone didn't add the sugar. In other words, if there wasn't, in Afrikaans we say die
The
vonk in die
catalyst.
kruisvat,
Yeah.
if there wasn't a spark to the fuel.
Yeah.
But
No,
on the other
absolutely.
hand, it wouldn't have boiled over if it wasn't Coke, a can of Coke in the first place. If it was just a can of water and someone added sugar. So there's an interesting debate about that. But yeah, I think it was more. I think we shouldn't neglect. People think. Well, I think we shouldn't neglect the fact that there was some underlying issues
Yeah.
which sort of led to this, which includes cultural issues, and I think that's the politically incorrect side of this. It includes economic issues. It includes demographic issues. It includes rising expectations. People who are poor and they keep hearing these promises by the government, and it includes ideological issues. It's a combination of things that led to these riots.
Absolutely. All right, so in the final moments, I'm going to ask you the two final questions here at the same time. One from Conscious Caracal asked earlier to ask you, what is Tucker like in person? And
Yeah.
then Chris Wyatt also asked earlier, what is the next big
Okay.
focus for AfriForum?
Okay. So we actually had dinner the night before the interview. Um, and we had a great discussion, a very like a social, evening. And Tucker is really, I mean, I don't know him that well, so I don't want to pretend that we're like best friends or something. That's not the case. But I spent some time with him, during the interview and obviously before the interview as well and after the interview as well. And my impression of him is that he really is a genuine person. That, in other words, if he says something on TV, it's because he really believes what he's saying.
Mm.
He's a very socially likable person in the sense that he's very humorous. He makes a lot of jokes. He's in a way a typical American dad, you can say. He talks about his family a lot. He talks about his hobbies. He makes jokes, and he talks about hunting and stuff like that. And my impression of him, sort of off camera, is he's just some guy in a way who really likes, who likes socializing, who likes making jokes, and who incidentally is also interested in politics. That's I don't know if he would agree with that. What I can add is he's very, very well read.
Mm.
And where the studio was, there's above the studio, there's like a library with, I guess, 1,000 books. And people, they say Tucker says he's read them all. Obviously, he hasn't read them all. No one's read 1,000 books. But during the discussion we had, I would mention someone during the interview and before, and he would immediately know who I'm talking about. Like during the interview, you can actually see it when I said Samora Machel said the following, and you can clearly see he knows who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And he's very clued up. He's very well read. That's absolutely true. Yeah, and he's a very likable person. I think a lot of people, he's one of these people, you love him or you hate him. And I think a lot of people who really dislike him because they don't agree with his politics, I think if they sat down with him just for a social evening, they would really have a great evening. So on that, no, I just saw a question. I didn't see his bow tie collection. The other question, what's coming up for AfriForum that's big? Well, we've got a bunch of stuff actually, but one of the things is Western Cape. So we opened an office in Cape Town recently. Our main head office is in Centurion. We have, I think, 7 full-time employees now in Cape Town. We have branches all over the country. In other words, when I say branches, I mean volunteers who are organizing communities. And I'm actually flying down to Cape Town tomorrow. We're going to spend the rest of the week there for a workshop, a planning workshop on how to push this thing about autonomy for the Western Cape. So I can say now, it's something we haven't said publicly. It's something that we are going to become much more outspoken on, and we have a bunch of, I think, really interesting ideas that I haven't heard other people talking about. It would be premature for me to discuss it now because we're actually going to discuss it tomorrow and the day after in a planning meeting. But probably in the next month, we're going to have a conference about autonomy for the Western Cape. And we're going to have a bunch of people who are big role players on this topic who will be speaking at the conference, who have already agreed. We've already commissioned research to be done on this topic. It's already been done. So we're going to have some people sort of release or publish some reports on
Fantastic.
issues regarding the Western Cape. And it's for us, it's not about the Western Cape; it's about the principle of decentralization of
Mm.
power. But the Western Cape is a particular. I'm not a Cape Townian. I grew up on the farthest side of the country from Cape Town, but so the point is not the Western Cape as such. It's the underlying principle of, as I said, decentralization of power, more autonomy for provinces in the first place, but local communities as well.
Fantastic. Ernst, thank you so much. That's it. Our time is done, and I want to keep my promise to you. So, thank you so much for joining me once again on the show. Please, when you've announced everything about the autonomy and all that stuff, like I would love to have you back on the show. We'll talk more
Mm.
about that and some other stuff as well. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. I'm always fascinated by the things you say, and I love having you on the show. So please don't be a stranger. Happily have you back.
I won't. Yeah, yeah. No, I'd love to speak to you about it again, certainly.
All right.
And I mean, if you're down in Cape Town, we'll invite you to the conference as well. Maybe you can,
Yeah,
we can get
just
in touch there.
send me the details.
Yeah,
Send
we
me the
will.
details, and I'll confirm. All right, Ernst, thank you so much. Have a good evening, and thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for everyone watching and commenting. It was a great discussion.
Awesome.
All
Cheers.
right. Cheers.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Ernst Roets from AfriForum chatting about his visit to the USA and everything. Well, we chatted about a whole lot of other things. We chatted about the ANC and their ideologies and the failed experiment of South Africa, as well as some secession, which I felt was very interesting. Secession is becoming a very big topic in South Africa at the moment. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for tuning in. All the comments, all the super chats, greatly appreciated. I will be back Thursday evening, ladies and gentlemen, for another show where comedians roast the headlines. Tune in for a great laugh and some fun times. Thank you all so much, and I will see you soon. Stay safe, be kind to one another, and I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.